All right. Welcome everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, depending on where you are in the world. It's great to welcome everyone in this JMS dialogue. In case you haven't been to a JMS dialogue, we try to organize these with the Journal of Management Studies, specifically on our point-counterpoint series, which are pieces that are about important controversies or debates in our field of management studies. And this time we have a debate on strategic management and climate change. To introduce myself, I'm Christopher Wickert. I'm one of the general editors at Journal of Management Studies. And it's my pleasure that I have here the authors of the Point and Two Counterpoints of our recent debate on whether or not strategic management needs to reinvent itself in light of climate change. So welcome Anita McGahan, who represents the Point paper. Welcome Nikolai Foss, who represents one of the Counterpoint papers. And welcome Jerry Davis, who's representing the second Counterpoint. So as you already see by the presence of two counterpoints to the points, there's a fierce contestation ongoing, and if you haven't done so already, I can only strongly recommend to read these three pieces. There's also an introduction available to it, where we as JMS editors try to position the whole thing in the conversation. It is an important topic, and I think while there's a high level of agreement that there is a problem, what we actually need to do about this problem, climate change and strategy, scholarship, research in particular, there's no agreement about this. And that thing makes the whole debate extremely insightful and interesting, and offers lots of food for thought for taking it further, hopefully in your own research, perhaps also education and beyond. So let's move to the point and counterpoints. We will have short presentations by the three author teams of a few minutes each. Then, because we're talking about debate here, there will be responses by the authors to each other as well. And I would like to give the floor to Anita first. What I'll do in the meantime is I post the links to all the four papers, so the point, the two counterpoints, and the introduction in the chat. So you just need to click on them and then you have them. So it's my pleasure to start this meeting, and Anita McGahan, thank you for being here, and let's hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Chris, and it's an honor and pleasure to be here with you all today. And special thanks to Chris and Nicole for organizing, to Nikolai and Jerry for being here. So there are five of us that are authors on this point called Strategy Can No Longer Ignore Planetary Boundaries, a call for tackling strategy's ecological fallacy. Several of us are here: Timo Bansal, Rudy Durand, Marcus Kreutzer, and Sven Kunisch. And then Nikolai and Peter and Jerry and Teddy wrote the counterpoints, both basically disagreeing, although the level of disagreement, I think, is something we can just talk about in the time that we have together. In our point, we made five basic points. We made five elements to our argument. The first is that climate change, which really is about breach of planetary boundaries and loss of biodiversity. So we're thinking here about not just climate change, but things like environmental pollution and other loss of biodiversity, that those problems are urgent and actionable. We could talk about the kinds of action, adaptation, remediation, and prevention. But the basic point is that these are important issues. A representation of that in my argument will be by highlighting this the world on fire thing icon here. For decades, our purpose in the field of strategy was to explain heterogeneity and firm performance, mainly profitability here. So I'm going to later make the argument that how we got here isn't as important as what we do now. But the basic idea here is that certainly in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, when I was a doctoral student and young professor, that what we were about, especially think of our classrooms, was talking about competitive advantage, how firms can improve their performance, we didn't really think beyond the industry really in our considerations. The third point is that by teaching our students to pursue profits, competitive advantage, superior performance, without any framework of thinking about climate or broader social aims or planetary boundaries, what we taught our students to do was to exploit externalities for years and years and years. And this has been central to the breaching of planetary boundaries. The fourth point is that strategy as a field can do some things about this, that we can add new dependent variables, we can do corporate analysis of planetary impact and so on, but that's not going to be enough for us to deal with all of the system level effects that accrue from adding up across companies of their impact. So, here's a simple example is that an emitter of, let's say, a carbon or some other gas, methane or something, that's next to another emitter, the cumulative effect of that methane over time is nonlinear. It's going to escalate. And so we need to add up in a way that's more thoughtful. And that leads us to our final point, which is we need a new foundational pillar in our thinking that considers these macro issues. So the core of our argument is that the diagnosis is that we have problems that we call the ecological fallacy, that the adding up of individual pursuit of profitability by companies over time does not equal the sum of the parts, that because of externalities and feedback loops and system effects, the pursuit of profits and growth by each firm leads us to the climate crisis and planetary boundary and biodiversity crisis. Our remedy is to repair strategy's foundation, to consider planetary boundaries in the first instance, new dependent variables, new ways of thinking about competition, new ways of pricing, scarce resources, and so on. But that's not going to be enough. We also need a new foundational pillar in the field of strategy with additional complementary scholarship on climate change. And Chris, let me stop there. That's the core of our argument. And over to you, Nikolai.
Sure. Thank you. Nikolai, yeah, what's your counterpoint?
All right, so the counterpoint is that Peter and I are not at all convinced that we need a new strategy paradigm, and that's so for a bunch of reasons. I should say I have quite a bit of material here because I was under the impression that I would have more than those 3 minutes that you talked about initially, Chris.
That's fine.
But fundamentally, we think that the critique of strategy in the point essay isn't that convincing, and that's so for two reasons. The first reason is that it's kind of pointless to blame strategy, which after all is a huge and heterogeneous field for complicity in climate change. But the reason we have anthropogenic climate change today is because we've had a 250 years long economic growth process, which has lifted a lot of people out of poverty. So the true root cause of anthropogenic climate change is actually people becoming much less poor. That's the real reason. We also think that the authors of the point essay don't really deliver a convincing argument that that existing strategy thinking, strategy as we know it, if you like, cannot help us address those climate challenges that admittedly we do face. Because after all, strategy is very much about economizing scarce resources. It's about efficiency, and it's therefore relevant under green growth. It's relevant certainly also even under degrowth, and it's of course relevant with a business as usual kind of scenario. And I would also argue that, in strategy as a field, we do know that there's such a thing as externalities, and it's not exactly that we are in love with coal, if you like. The second reason why we don't buy the call for a new strategy paradigm has to do with the treatment of decisions makers and decision making. That we feel that just too many things that are unclear here, because it's at the end of the day, it's unclear who are supposed to make the decisions under the new strategy paradigm. As mentioned of stakeholders, who are those stakeholders exactly? How are the interests represented, measured, weighed, aligned, and so on? And sometimes there's mention of nature, which comes into the discussion, it seems, as an independent decision maker. And of course, the authors talk about nature metaphorically, but what we often see when people talk about nature making decisions and having a preference function is that it boils down to a call for a certain number of individuals, typically activists or bureaucrats or politicians, to basically make decisions on nature's behalf. And we think that is worrying. Relatedly, there isn't much talk about objective functions here. So there's implicitly, presumably, there's some kind of social welfare function at play, and it needs to guide decision making at the firm level. But again, where does this social welfare function come from? How is it turned into practical decision making? There's, I think, something like total impact accounting is mentioned in passing in the essay, but that is probably not a realistic approach, because it's literally impossible to engage in. So what's the alternative here? Is it centralized political decision making, or what is it? At the end of the day, we think company boards, top managers are not really equipped to deal with public policy, which the essay calls for reasons of competence and also for reasons of interests. So we should not burden strategy as a field with public policy. That's better left for a different domain. Final thing I want to mention is that we think the Point essay smacks of alarmism. We actually only mentioned that in the abstract to our counterpoint, but Christopher decided to make quite a bit out of it in his introduction to the symposium. And I would like, if you read the climate panel reports, they don't strike me as alarmist at all. I mean, there's no mention of something like, for example, human extinction. Although, of course, there's talk about rising sea levels, droughts, and so on. But that leads into the next point. What is actually the overall policy stance of the Point essay? Are you calling for degrowth? Are you calling for green growth? What exactly is where you're heading? What do you want us to do exactly? Peter, on my perspective, of course, is that we should harness markets. We should embrace innovation. We should sustain continuing economic growth. And if we do this, we very much need traditional strategy thinking, because again, this is about efficiency. It's about engaging in innovation, including green innovation. It's revealing to the market who are the best producers of, say, new green solutions. So at the end of the day, in a nutshell, we are calling for sustained economic growth, because this is what we need in order to be able to adapt to the challenges of climate change. We also know that economic growth means richer populations, and when people become richer, their preferences change, including they change towards sustainability. And interestingly, there's research that shows that the global South doesn't support things like degrowth or even growth at low levels for obvious and understandable reasons. Because what are we concerned with here? We are ultimately, all of us, I hope, concerned with human welfare. And when we talk about human welfare, it's something that, in spite of critiques, is very well measured by GDP. So we should go for continuing GDP growth. And I don't know if you know about these scenarios that the climate panel also organized, the socioeconomic pathways plan scenarios, which imply, this is the median scenario, a 450% increase of today's welfare levels by the end of the century. And fighting climate change will then reduce this to 434%. So yeah, we'll be much richer, but we'll be so rich that we can afford to effectively combat climate change through, for example, building dikes and whatnot. That was a little bit about 3 minutes. Apologies for that, Christopher, but again, I misunderstood your instructions.
That's perfectly fine. Thank you, Nikolai. And let's hear the other counterpoint of Jerry Davis, which, well, I'm curious to hear what you have to say in response to this.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. Unfortunately, Teddy can't be here, but so Teddy and I sort of violently agree with Anita and co-authors' diagnosis about strategy and climate change. We're really organization theory guys, and so our response is not let's fix strategy, but maybe strategy is basically hopeless. So we argue that the field of strategy incubated during a time of shareholder primacy, and that its entire structure is oriented towards sort of creating shareholder value, sustainable competitive advantage, and that the field basically can't be saved. So that's where we end up, which is a little bit different. I think what I'm going to say is going to be more a response to what Nikolai just said. Our assertion in the paper is that sustaining a habitable planet requires decarbonizing the economy as quickly as possible, and that business schools have an essential role to help make that happen, but it's going to be hard because of their recent history. Now, it has been getting a lot hotter around the world. There's not a lot of debate around the facts for that. The records in the last couple of years have been fairly astonishing. I for one, would not want to live in Houston in the neighborhood of Peter. Not coincidentally, the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have also been going up from about 315 parts per million in 1960 to over 420 today. Where does this carbon dioxide come from? It comes from fossil fuels. About 80% of the world's carbon emissions come from the use of fossil fuels, specifically coal, oil, and gas. That is the source of the externalities. It's not some mystery out there in the world. It's specifically a small number of fuels that are overwhelmingly responsible for carbon emissions in the atmosphere. And it turns out that it's also not a mystery who the major emitters are. It's not sort of broad operations of capitalism, but 20 specific companies are actually responsible for about a third of the carbon emissions in the past 60 years. And so it's not a mystery. It's a relatively small number of companies. Some of them have also acknowledged the role of carbon dioxide in global warming going back to the early 1990s. So the carbon emitters are aware of the potential consequences of their actions. How do we find ourselves in this situation? Well, when those oil executives or coal executives went to business school, they learned a few things, particularly in their strategy class. The social responsibility of business is to increase its profits, that corporations and their managers are obligated to pursue shareholder value. They learned about 5 forces and VRIO and non-market strategy, which Anita and friends describe as the strategy paradigm, and that's what I understand the strategy paradigm to be, and that profit moats are an effective way to create shareholder value. When they got back to their oil companies, they engaged in, many of them specifically engaged in practices to try to obfuscate the impact of carbon on climate change, because that would constrain their profitability and under-enrich their shareholders. And that would be bad from the perspective of what they learned in their in business schools and in their strategy class. So far, so uncontroversial. All of this part has just been purely factual claims. Can we blame business schools and especially the field of strategic management for this? And I think, yes, we can. This is every business school professor's most hated document, a paper by Durand and co-authors showing that executives or top executives that get business school educations go on to lower the labor share, but don't improve profitability. In the US and specifically Denmark, it's odd to me that Denmark gets called out. So Nikolai, I don't know if you're, how much CBS has to do with this. And you might reasonably say, okay, but that's very backwards looking. Business schools have really taken this on. It's water under the bridge. Business schools are now controlled by a woke mind virus and spend all their time teaching DEI and ESG and SDGs. So problem solved. And if you think that, you are probably living in Europe, because in Europe, this might well be true. I've noticed you walk into the lobby of every European business school and you see sustainable development goals pasted all over the lobby. This is from EM Lyon, but every European business school that I visit talks about the SDGs. Come over the pond to the United States of America and you will not encounter the SDGs. In fact, I was teaching a class of 60 executive MBA students this summer, asked them how many before my course had heard of the SDGs. 5 hands went up. Americans have no clue what the SDGs are, and ESG has become wildly controversial. We're not teaching this stuff in American business curriculum. There are some counterexamples. The University of San Diego on the 3rd floor, I did manage to discover some sustainable development goals, but they're the oddballs. I want to emphasize sort of 2 closing points. One is that what we teach is so much more important than what we publish. The US graduates 400,000 undergraduate business majors per year. And if they are not being taught about climate, that feels like we're not fulfilling our responsibility. What we publish in SMJ has no impact on the world. What we teach can have a very big impact. Effective action to address climate change requires an all-out mobilization equivalent to something like World War II, according to Paul Adler. What won't work is turning that over to entrepreneurs and markets in a bottom-up solution. If you wanted to mobilize against, say, unhelpful neighbors who are invading, I don't think we want to turn that over to markets or entrepreneurs. What might work is reconfiguring business schools as sort of decarbonization academies. And sorry for going over, but thank you for that.
Thank you, Jerry. That was again insightful. I will give the floor back to Anita to respond to what we just heard from both of you, from Nikolai and Jerry.
Oh, thank you so much. Excuse me. First of all, thank you so much, Nikolai and Jerry, not just for your ideas today, but your friendship over so many decades and your thoughtful interventions. I want to focus now on the structure of our disagreements and point to some areas where I think we actually are pretty aligned and some areas specifically where I think we're unaligned here. So in the diagnosis, we have some disagreement, particularly across the counterpoint. So Nikolai and Peter are saying, and I don't want to overstate this, but Nikolai is saying, look, you know, the climate and planetary boundary crisis is manageable. It's something we can address. I don't want to misrepresent the alarmism point. The alarmism point in their introduction was a cause of some alarm among us. But in any case, at this point, I want to be fair here, and of course, and say, you know, I believe that my friends Peter and Nikolai are saying that it's manageable. That's the key point. There's some disagreement, especially in writing, about whether or not the field has been focused on heterogeneity and firm performance, and whether the pursuit of profitability leads to this adding up crisis or this ecological fallacy, which is statistical. So there's some disagreement on that side. But as Jerry said at the beginning of his argument on the diagnosis, Teddy and Jerry are in vehement agreement with us that climate and planetary boundaries are of incredible concern, that the history of the field, especially in the United States, has been one of focusing on profits at all ends, and that we've taught students to chase after profits for some decades to our collective peril. On the remedies, I think Jerry and Teddy are basically saying, you know, especially given the ethos from U.S. business schools, which are so pervasive in our culture, that we can't get there. That strategy would have to lose its essence, would have to morph into organization theory to really do everything that needs to get done, and we're not going to be better organizational theorists than our organizational theory colleagues and friends. And so we need to, I think, probably, you know, come to terms and maybe rethink the entirety of our enterprise. Whereas Nikolai and Peter say, look, some of these cracks in the foundations of the field have been addressed. We are seeing some change, maybe some of the changes originating in Europe, as Jerry described here. And that, I think, a very important point, and Nikolai, please keep me honest, you may or may not, I want you to tell me if you agree with this. If we did what Tima and Rudy and Marcus and Sven and I want to do, we might encourage corruption, centralization, a kind of authoritarian bureaucracy that could be corrupt and could be problematic. So the structure here is Peter and Nikolai disagree with our diagnosis and feel our remedies would be inappropriate. Jerry and Teddy agree with our diagnosis, but find the situation hopeless, basically. So I'm going to focus here on the big picture. I'm not going to quibble about the history of the field here. Let me say a few things here. So I'm not going to get into whether the planetary boundary crisis and the climate crisis is real and substantive and urgent. I'm just gonna move forward. Okay, I think the evidence that Jerry presented is incontrovertible, and the facts are clear. And as Al Gore said when he came to visit us, I've got to move past that at this stage of my life. Well, let's just say that there we are. Okay, in some sense, whether we got here primarily through the field of strategy and whether or not whether or not the field of strategy has been complicit in this crisis almost doesn't matter in some level to the urgency of the remedies that we need to pursue. So I'm going to take that off the table for now. I think it's an important debate that we could look at our origins and think about how to allocate blame and responsibility. In our paper, Tima, Rudy, Marcus, and Sven and I say we don't think there was an intent on the part of strategy scholars to pursue some sort of venal externality crisis that led us where we are. We think the intentions were exactly to pursue the kinds of prosperity that Nikolai has described. But we ended up in a place that Jerry describes, where we've taught stuff that leads people to do things that Veit Hennisch just described in an interview that I did with him, is basically monetizing stakeholder exploitation, whether or not that's in the future. I'm quoting him, so please don't hold me to that because he's not here to defend himself. But if you're interested in that, you can check out pi2.burnscenter.org, where I'm posting some of these interviews I'm doing. The key thing is that it was heterogeneity and firm performance that got us to where we are. The pursuit of profits without thinking about whether we're breaching planetary boundaries here. All we need to move forward in our argument is the argument that system level effects, what we call the ecological fallacy, which is the adding up problem, that the collective effect on the planet of pursuing profits has been problematic for biodiversity and planetary boundaries. We also want to take off the table whether or not a strategy can change. We do believe that strategy can change. We think adding a new pillar is going to be a lot of work, but we want to do the work. We think that the field of strategy can add something to our conversations with org theorists like Jerry and Teddy and others about strategy for getting there. What technologies need to emerge? How do we implement them? What kinds of organizations can do that? How do we use competition fruitfully to get there? And while we could debate the USA versus European thing, the core point that Jerry and Teddy made about the importance of teaching, we agree with. Okay, so we think that what we teach in the classroom matters, and we want to reconstitute that. Okay, we also agree with Nikolai and Peter that we don't want an authoritarian bloodbath. We agree with that. We think it's going to be a lot of work to do what we're describing, and we also agree that we didn't describe all the work that needs to get done to address planetary boundaries in our article. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do the work. The fact that the work could be done badly in the future doesn't mean we shouldn't try to deal with this incredible crisis of our times. We still have to do the work, and we have to avert the bloodbaths, even though it's going to be hard. So where are we in the end? We have quite a bit of disagreement, of agreement, and then a little bit of disagreement that I want to end on here. We have agreement that climate crises and planetary boundaries are binding. We have agreement that externalities and system effects matter. And I think I heard Nikolai talk about externalities, so I think we're okay there too. We have agreement that strategies cracks can be filled, especially if we all put our shoulders to the wheels to think about repricing important valuable resources and improving competition and thinking about stakeholders differently. And we even have some I think we need to do a lot more than only think about stakeholders myself. So there's a lot of work to do there. We agree that we need to avoid bloodbaths. We agree that teaching is critical, and what we say in our business school is teaching is critical. And I think Jerry and Teddy agree that we need strategy to reconstitute itself at a fundamental level, perhaps to create a new foundational pillar that would be complementary to the repair work. In other words, we're not saying we should get rid of corporate level analysis. We're saying we should add to it a new pillar that deals with system level effects. In the end, where we disagree leads us to the following bottom line, and I'm going to end here, Chris, which is that if you believe that climate change and planetary boundaries are real and urgent, then the field of strategy needs to work on this. The two missing pieces on our diagnosis on the prior slide are at the upper left. If we believe that climate crisis and planetary boundaries are real, we need to work on that as a field. That's the bottom line for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anita. It seems that in this webinar you're being nicer to each other than you are in the papers. So make sure to read all the three pieces. Nikolai, do you want to give a brief response to this?
Okay, I can try. Thanks for being so. What's the word? Conciliatory, I think is the word, Anita. But you're very good at that in general.
Oh, I want to be constructive. I want us to move
constructive.
That's fine. That's fine.
I actually agreed with quite a bit of what you said. However, I do think there are a number of premises underlying what both you and Jerry are saying that probably are not correct. And you know, in strategy, we talk about causal identification all the time, right? And we are at pains to establish sound and proper causal identification. But none of you apparently have any problems jumping to the conclusion that what we teach in business schools causally matters to the ongoing climate challenges that we're facing. I think you need to. It strikes me as a little bit too self-congratulatory. I'm not sure we are that important, right? Jerry's point, though, about European versus US business schools may very well be true. I don't know enough about the US business schools, but certainly over the last 20 years, it has been sustainability all over here in Europe. So if you believe the causal argument, in Europe at least, we're less blameworthy, right? Another premise, which is more important in your argument, both of you, is that we need immediate, urgent action in response to the climate challenges, and these responses better be dramatic or drastic. And Jerry even made a parallel to a war economy, basically referring back to the Second World War. Couple of comments that relate to this. The first, most obvious comment has to do with what Anita also mentioned, namely that when you take that kind of urgent, dramatic action, which is comparable to a war economy, you are unavoidably talking about authoritarianisms. Even Britain became a little bit authoritarian during Second World War, and the US also did in a number of ways. So, I mean, that if you're really serious about urgent, dramatic, large-scale action, like establishing a war economy, it seems to me that unavoidably you're talking about a concentration of political powers that amounts to authoritarianism. The second comment, which perhaps again is more important, is that urgent, full-scale, dramatic action is incredibly costly. And there are people who have calculated the costs of this. And I'm baffled by the fact that a name like William Nordhaus doesn't come up at all in this discussion. He's not even mentioned in any of the essays. This is a guy who, along with other economists, have actually tried to calculate the costs of different kinds of actions in response to climate change. And all calculations show that the kind of action that you're talking about is incredibly costly. And it massively destroys value. Net benefits, and they're large, are negative. Let's see. Yeah, I think I'll stop there. I was asked to keep it short. So.
Thank you, Nikolai.
Okay. Okay.
Jerry, I'll give you the final word on this, but please also keep it short, and then we can open the floor for discussion. So I see a few questions already in the chat, but now is maybe a good moment to think of questions that you want to pose to the authors. Jerry, please.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And Nikolai puts his finger on it. If you believe that the climate is in crisis and that large-scale action is needed, then inevitably we're going to need centralized direction to some degree. Whether we want to call this authoritarian or not is a different matter. Would we say that the Roosevelt administration was authoritarian in mobilizing the arsenal of democracy and saving all of you in Europe from certain doom and darkness? Maybe, but it felt like it worked pretty well. And I'd say the research on the ongoing impacts of the Second World War on American industry are pretty good. Civilized, sort of the creation of a reasonable welfare state, civilized human resource practices. Industry got a lot better because of the mobilization in the US for the Second World War. So this is what we're contemplating, and Paul Adler has written nicely about that. If you don't think the problem's such a big deal, if we can tinker around the edges and wait for some clever entrepreneurs to come up with modest inventions, maybe that will help. I think if we look to what entrepreneurs are doing these days, they're creating cryptocurrency that uses more electricity than Japan. They're creating generative AI that is spewing more carbon into the atmosphere. If we leave it to Silicon Valley and entrepreneurs rather than a more centralized response, I think we're going to see that crazy looking parts per million graph spike upward. So I'm not really enthused about allowing entrepreneurs trained in business schools and funded by particular venture capitalists. I'm not sure I want to turn over the planet to these people, because we all suffer from the consequences of that. But if we're wrong about that, if there's lots of ways to get out of the climate crisis and that business school doesn't actually teach anybody anything, then we can sort of go home and be happy that students actually don't follow up on the things that we teach them. So.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. And thanks everyone for listening in. So maybe in light of the time, I would give Anita the final word.
Well, just huge thanks to you, Christopher, for organizing this point-counterpoint session and for editing the journal, which has become such a great leader in generating insights in this domain. Thanks to Nicole Broadbent for her leadership as well, and to my friends, Nikolai and Jerry, and to all of you.
Good, thank you. So also from my side, or from the side of JMS, thank you everyone for joining in. So I hope this was inspirational for you. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you to those who engaged with us and asked some questions. Maybe as a sneak preview, we do have another point-counterpoint series in the making, which is also on climate change, but has a substantially different twist. It's more on a system level rather than strategic management. This will come out in the next few months, I suppose. So there's lots of more things to talk about, and I hope you listen in at the next JMS Dialogue then. And I wish everyone a nice, rest of the day, evening, night, wherever you are. Thank you for joining.